Hello, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. Today, I am running an encore presentation of an interview with NPR books editor and my good friend, Petra Mayer. Petra died suddenly and tragically over the weekend, and she was a dear friend. She remains in my heart forever. And when we talked about creativity and writing and books and her perspective on where we are in the publishing industry, she said prescient things because she's just that good. And I wanted to run this episode again for you because I think, first of all, anyone who gets to hear her is enriched by the experience. And I want to honor her the best way I know how, through radio or podcasting, because that was and ever will be her great love. This episode is from when the podcast was still called the Creative Mindset Podcast, I think. So you're getting a throwback to things the way they used to be. I hope you enjoy this episode. I know actually that you will. I miss my friend and I love her. And also, she's the best doggone editor. She edited my book, Speak From Within. She's edited so much for NPR. She's done amazing work in radio. And I know her family, her friends, her colleagues, and all her many fans will miss her forever.
It's a two-part thing. There has to be more representation in the upper echelons of publishing, and there has to be more acknowledgement that if you are going to tell stories that are outside of your cultural experience, you need to do it well.
Hello, and welcome to the Creative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. In the show, my guests and I explore how we can use creativity to do our best work and live our best lives. I talk with authors, musicians, actors, scientists, and others who are all pushing the envelope to live fully, creatively, and authentically. Listen in to get the scoop on how you can do it too. Hello, and welcome to the Creative Mindset Podcast. My name is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I am super happy that you're here. I am also incredibly happy with today's guest. I'm so glad that she was willing and able to come onto the show. First of all, Petra Mayer is an editor and resident nerd at NPR Books, focusing on fiction and particularly genre fiction. And I'm really excited to talk to her about what genre fiction actually means. Listen to this. She brings to the job passion, speed reading skills, which is true. I have seen her finish a 600-page book in like a minute, and a truly impressive collection of Doctor Who doodads. You can also hear her on the air and on the occasional episode of Pop Culture Happy Hour. Additionally, Petra has been a dear friend of mine for many years, so I'm so super excited that we get to have this chat. Petra, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I will endeavor to live up to that wonderful introduction.
Oh, come on. You're fabulous. And I can say that, being your friend for many years, I can totally say that. So let's talk a little bit about all of the stuff that you've done. You spent time working in Europe for, was it Radio Free Europe? Is that what
Yes,
I'm
it
remembering?
was.
Yes. What was that like?
That was truly weird. So I ended up at Radio Free Europe. I had been in the public radio system. Do you want I can give you the whole long story.
Oh, I would love the whole long story. The juicier, the better.
I don't know how juicy it is. I started working at NPR as an intern in 1994. It was my college job. I was an engineering services intern, and that meant that my job was basically servicing reel-to-reel tape machines, which tells you how old I am. So I decided that I had to learn enough right quick so that I could come back on the news side of things, because to be honest, I failed the test to be a broadcast recording technician. So I went to graduate school and I hated it with a fiery passion and I was miserable. And luckily I was at an internship fair and Radio Free Europe was there. And I was like, you know what? I am burned the hell out. They're going to pay me to live in Prague. Hell yeah. I don't care what I'm doing. So I moved to Prague 20 years ago, good Lord. And I Radio Free Europe at that point was a little bit adrift because it was 1999. And, at that point, we kind of all thought, oh, the Cold War is over, the wall has fallen, it's all democracy and capitalism from here on out. Whether or not you think that's good, it was what the sort of zeitgeist at the time was. So Radio Free Europe had been formed in the 50s to sort of spread the gospel of American culture and soft power behind the Iron Curtain. And at that point, they kind of didn't know what to do with themselves because the Iron Curtain, as we knew it, no longer really existed. So my job was kind of unformed, and I ended up being what they called an audio editor, which was, you know, it was kind of my job to because a lot of what they put on the air was just written copy that people read, and so it was my job to work audio clips into it however I could. And on the side of that, my job also was I was an audio archivist, because they had this giant room in their Prague headquarters that was just full. It had maybe a 20-foot ceiling, and it was just full all the way up, an entire wall of crumbling reel-to-reel tapes. And part of my job was to take those tapes down, put them on an old machine, try not to let them crumble all over me, and try to figure out what the hell was on them,
Wow.
which was a variety of really random stuff. There were like Politburo meetings from Romania and the finals of the 1959 International Talking Bird Competition and early electronic music and pirate broadcasts from the Hungarian uprising of '56, which made me cry when I listened to them. So yeah, it was, and also like we'd get bomb threats occasionally, and when the bomb threats happened, we would all just screw off and hang around in Letna Park with beer. So it was, it was an interesting job.
Wow. That's wow. That just you just talked about reams of culture and history from over the last like 60, 70 years, all in that one little room. That sounds incredible.
Yeah, and there were rumors about stuff that was in there that I never found. Like supposedly there were like Beatles performance, like recordings of Beatles performances and Miles Davis and all kinds of stuff, but I never found anything more than Morris dancing. There was a
Oh,
lot of Morris dancing. I don't know what's up with that.
Morris dancing is cool. Hey. So then after that, you ended up coming back to the DC area, and then what happened? Did you go straight back to NPR, or did you do something else in between?
No, I went straight back to NPR. I left Radio Free Europe after 2 years because, oh, hang on one second. Godfrey, going,
So
me,
Godfrey
that's
is
my
Petra's cat.
cat. Yeah, I
Oh
don't
my
care.
goodness.
Yeah,
So,
he was trying to tear up a craft project and he didn't like being interrupted.
oh, I understand. Cats get very busy about that sort of thing.
Anyways, so I had been in Prague for 2 years, which is sort of classically the point at which you either go native or come home. And I, well, not to point fingers, but they made my job permanent and then gave it to a dude who was a friend of my boss and expected me to train him. So I was like, nope, and I came home.
I think that's valid.
And
Absolutely.
I sort of pestered my way into a 2-week temp gig at NPR. I can't remember where I was. I think it was weekend edition Saturday. Um, and that just sort of spun out into an ever expanding string of temp gigs. And after about 2 years, I landed at a permanent job at Weekend All Things Considered, as a sort of junior production assistant. And I was there for about 10 years and eventually sort of worked my way into being the books editor, because we had a host for several years who was a really avid reader, and he was a fast reader and he could do a couple of book interviews a week. That's the thing about NPR, by the way, like our hosts actually read the books, which is why, like, if your publicist can't get an interview on NPR, it's because your book is probably too long or too complicated, because we do read the whole thing in order to ask smart questions, and that is a real deciding factor in whether your book gets on the air.
Wow, I didn't realize that that was part of the sort of the criteria about whether or not you could. Because for me personally, the things that you do are, well, they're fascinating, but books isn't the only thing. So now that you are a books editor, it sounds to me like you're also still, because you were on air on Weekend All Things Considered sometimes, and you're also on air sometimes now. Is that the case? Like what do you do? What are your responsibilities as an NPR books
I
editor?
kind
Because
of
it
hate it when people ask me that. I kind of hate it when people ask me that because it's so hard to explain. I mean, technically, my title is editor 3 on the arts desk at NPR, but you can also call me an editor at NPR Books. I'm also a reporter sometimes. So basically, the arts desk at NPR is pretty small, and we all have to perform a lot of functions. So I am the core of my job is that I edit book reviews, specifically fiction, for npr.org/books, which is the NPR Books homepage. And then I'm also a general purpose arts desk editor. I edit radio pieces. Hang on one second. Godfrey!
This isn't an interview with Petra Mayer. This is an interview with Petra Mayer and Godfrey Mayer. I think that's the...
Yeah. He's really relishing the fact that mommy is home all day, every day.
I have no doubt.
It's also getting close to dinner time, so they're going to be extra pestery. Anyway, so where was it? Right. So my primary job is editing fiction reviews for npr.org/books. I am also a general purpose arts desk editor. I edit radio pieces from our correspondents and freelancers on just about anything. I frequently get pressed into service to do what they call spots, which are the very short, usually no longer than a minute, stories that you hear during the newscasts at the top and bottom of the hour. I also am a reporter on my own. I do a lot of book stories. I interview authors. And another thing that happens is when there's cultural news that our sort of senior editors know is important, but it's too nerdy and they don't understand it, that's when they call me in. So I cover San Diego Comic-Con, like when there's a new companion on Doctor Who, they call me in. Although our TV, not to steal shine from our TV correspondent, Eric Deggans, he's a giant Whovian too. But basically, I'm the nerd correspondent. Like when I have to put it in shorthand, that's what I tell people.
I see. Okay, so I have to ask, what has been your favorite nerdy thing that you've done as an NPR Books editor?
Oh, that's tough.
I know.
Nerdy thing.
Yeah. I know it's a tough question because I'm sure there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to nerdy things you've gotten to do. But can you think of something that's been just
well,
wow?
my favorite nerdy thing, it isn't really, I mean, my favorite, it's sort of nerdy. It's not like, sci-fi fantasy nerdy, but my favorite nerdy thing that I've gotten to do recently is that the guy who takes care of the ravens at the Tower of London, he's called the Raven Master. He put out a memoir last year or the year before, I can't remember. And I was in London on vacation, and I arranged to interview him. And so he let me into the Tower of London at 7 a.m. before all of the tourists were there. And I got to follow him around while he fed the ravens and he talked to them, and I could hang out with the ravens and I learned all their names and their habits. And it was really, really cool.
That sounds amazing.
So I'm a history nerd, so technically that's nerdy, right?
Yep, of course it is. No, absolutely. And also super cool. I mean, nerds are cool. So there you go. So,
Thanks.
so how much of what you do ends up being on the radio versus how much of it is on the website? Like how do those duties split when you're working?
Oh, it's almost, it's maybe 80% on the website. Although when I'm on the radio too, I also will build out a web component, because that's the thing about the arts desk is that we were one of the first desks at NPR to be really hybrid digital radio. Like many legacy media organizations, NPR's digital operations were initially very walled off from the radio operations, and now they're, making a real effort to integrate it. So I always try to report my stories for both digital and radio. But I would say 80% of the time I'm doing online only stuff. I also, by the way, I forgot to mention this, recently have been appointed the editor of our new video gaming column. So I'm coordinating a lot of online and on-air video games coverage too.
Oh, wow. And especially right now with a lot of people spending a lot of time playing
Oh my God,
video
the amount of
games.
Animal Crossing coverage we've done.
I should probably turn in my nerd card because I have never played Animal Crossing, but maybe someday. I still hold hope.
It's
So
fine. You don't have to pay.
no, I don't have to play Animal Crossing to be a nerd. I'm a
Mhm.
full-fledged nerd in other ways. So when you're editing somebody's work? Like you're editing a review of somebody else's book? Is that what's going on? Is that
Yes,
what?
I'm editing. So I am not a reviewer myself. I
Mhm.
used to be, but because I'm an editorial employee of NPR, I'm really not supposed to express opinions about the areas that I cover. So that actually, it's great. It gets me out of a lot of political arguments because I'm not supposed to express a lot of opinions. It means I can't argue with people online. It's great. I have a pass. Uh,
Yeah, oh, I wish I did. I keep getting too involved. So you're editing, someone else, someone's agent or a publishing company submits a book to NPR and you assign
that's not
a reviewer, or
exactly how it
how does
works.
that work? Yeah, I would love to know because that's
Sure.
something that's a bit of a mystery. Like, how do you decide where?
It's a mixture of things. So
Mhm.
I have a stable of freelancers because there's just so much out there. I kind of liken it a little bit to representative democracy, right? Like there's so much out there that I cannot one-to-one look at every book and make a decision. So I rely on trusted representatives to tell me what they're interested in.
Okay.
So that's part of it. My reviewers will sort of on a more or less quarterly basis or seasonal basis send me lists of things that they're interested in.
Mhm.
And then I also am constantly having meetings with publicists for all the major publishing houses. So I don't know when this is going to air, but right now, as we're speaking, it's the end of May, and we're coming up on Book Expo, which is the major trade show of the year.
Mhm.
It's usually in the Javits Center, which is right now an emergency pandemic hospital.
Right.
So Book Expo is a series of virtual meetings this year, but generally that's where I and a lot of the other people at the shows who deal with books and our nonfiction editor and a lot of other reporters will just go to New York and pack ourselves into a conference room and spend 2 or 3 days of back to back to back meetings with publicists from all of the imprints, and where they show us their catalogs for summer and fall and into the next year, and we make notes and we fight over who gets what, and we do a lot of advanced planning. And I'm doing meetings like that all year round. So like if your publicist has a compelling pitch, sure, you have a pretty good chance of getting some attention from us.
Mhm. And so in that situation, like at Book Expo, since it's virtual this time, I would imagine sort of the accidental compelling pitch is probably not going to happen. It's got to be, you have to be in the room where it happens, to quote Hamilton.
Well,
So
and also there, I mean, yes, because there are some serendipitous things. Like one thing that happens at Book Expo is you get tons of freebies, and I take them back to my hotel room and I look through them in the evening, and periodically I find something where I'm like, whoa, this is something we need to pay attention to. Like that happened with Pierce Brown's Red Rising trilogy a few years ago. I got the first one as a freebie at Book Expo and ripped through it in an evening, and it was like, this is an author that we need to pay attention to. So I looked at my stable of reviewers and I found a guy who I was like, he will really be into this. He will do it justice. And I signed it to him, and yeah, that became a whole thing. I'm not taking credit for Pierce Brown's success. Let me just put that right out there. I'm not. But like that was an example of a serendipitous discovery of something that I felt deserved our attention.
and that's really cool that those kinds of things happen, I think, because it is otherwise, if you're going the traditional publishing route, a little bit challenging if to make that sort of serendipity happen, so within that framework, when you find something, like if one of your reviewers pitches it to you, that's one thing. When you find something that you just love,
Mhm.
the process is you then assign it, and then it goes up as a story, or does it go up on the website? Like, what can you run me through what happens
Sure.
to a
So
review?
we um, we NPR no longer do on-air book reviews,
Mhm.
which makes me sad, and I wish I could change it. But on-air book reviews are very laborious. If you hear a book review on air, that is fresh air. It's not us, because
Mhm.
they have Maureen Corrigan, who is their on-air book reviewer. Um, so what happens is, like, once I have decided that we are going to review a book, either because it was pitched to me or I discovered it serendipitously or one of my reviewers pitched it to me, um, then I look at my stable of reviewers and I think about who is best suited to this book, like who has the background or the taste or, or the style that would do it justice. And I ask the reviewer, hey, are you interested in this? Sometimes they say no,
Mhm.
but hopefully they say yes. And then I have a standard deadline, which is 2 weeks before publication. So although nobody ever sticks to that. um, and also, so I have a couple of criteria. Like I have a deadline. I personally prefer a very conversational style. I want readers to feel like they know my reviewers and they want to know what a particular person has to say about the book. Like I want them to be appointment reading, like, oh my God, the sequel to Harrow the Ninth is coming out, or this, sorry, excuse me, scratch that because I said the wrong thing. Oh my God, the sequel to Gideon the Ninth is coming out. I wonder what Jason Sheehan has to say about that because he was so crazy about the first book. Like that's what I want people to think about. So I try very carefully to match books with not who I think will give it a positive review, but who I think is best positioned to review it. Because we do negative reviews. Like that's a thing, especially if, well, particularly if they can be constructive. Like we don't do hatchet jobs, but if we can give constructive criticism, we do. Anyhow, so I'm getting off track.
Not at all.
Once I assign the review, more or less to deadline, the reviewer will turn in the copy and I will edit it. And hopefully if they're, everything I want them to be, I won't have to do much editing. I mean, I have to deal with so much volume that I've kind of developed a stable of people that I don't have to edit very much because they're so good to begin with. That's the secret to my job. And so I take that copy and I'm also, I forgot to say this, on top of my other duties, I'm just a web production grunt. So I take a lot of the interviews that you hear on the shows and I turn them into web pages. And so once the reviewer has filed the copy and I've edited it and I've fact checked it, I've made sure that they haven't, spelled a character name wrong or gotten a plot point wrong, checked their quotes. Then I dump it into our CMS and I create like what we call the book edition page, which has all of our e-commerce information and an image of the book cover. I pull quotes, I include relevant links to like interviews or other work by the same author, other reviews by the same critic. And then I do a final pass on it and that goes to our copy edit desk and then it goes up on the website.
Oh, is that all? Wow. Okay. Yeah. It's funny because, as the person who's interviewing you for the podcast, I'm like, whoa, but as your friend, I'm double woeing. That's quite a lot. So when you do that, it goes up on the website, all of that stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all, you are just the fiction side, right? There is an NPR editor for books on the nonfiction side,
There is
correct?
an NPR editor for books. Oh, and I also forgot. I keep forgetting. There are little bits of my job that I forget because there's so many of them. I also run our social media feed. So if you follow NPR Books on Twitter or Facebook or Tumblr, that's me. We don't have an Instagram because I'm old and I can't deal with Instagram. So also what I'm responsible for is every day I look at the NPR Books page and I schedule social media posts to promote all of the stuff. Is this also a good time to talk about our seasonal projects, or are you going to ask me about that later?
Oh, I'm absolutely going to ask you about
okay,
them. That's coming up.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, it was the next question. I was going to talk to you about. I know that every year for a few years now, you've been doing something called the Summer Concierge Series, and
That's actually the summer reader poll. The concierge is in the winter.
oh, see, there you go. I have my facts wrong. So, talk about both of them if you would. The reader poll, what it is and what it means, and also the concierge series. That'd be great if you could
Sure,
talk a
yeah.
little bit about
Actually,
what those are.
this is an opportune moment because I am just ramping up on this year's edition of the summer poll. So the summer poll is a thing that we do every year where we invite readers. We pick a genre every year. This year it's kids books, like picture books and very early chapter books. And we invite readers to nominate their 5 favorite books and or series in the chosen genre. And then I take those thousands and we use a forum on our website that dumps everything into a Google Doc, and sort of there's no set period that the voting is open. The voting is open until I go, oh my God, there's 5,000 votes. I can't handle any more of this. And I close the poll. And then I take the Google Doc with 5,000 votes, many of which will be misspelled. And I sort of rectify everything and sort it and classify it and figure out how many votes each title or series got, and I take the top 250 of them and I send them to a panel of judges, because this is not just a straight up poll. If it were, like, we would literally have nothing but Harry Potter for every single genre. In order to best provide a service to our readers, we can't just reflect back what they like. It has to be a discovery tool. It has to be more balanced. It has to include voices that are otherwise overlooked. So that's where the judging panel comes in. We have 4 people, authors or critics, in the chosen genre. So this year, because it's kids' books, our kids' books columnist Juanita Giles is one of the judges. Margaret Willison, the internet's favorite librarian, is one. And then we have 2 amazing authors, Linda Sue Park and Andrea Davis Pinkney. And what they will do is I'll send them this list of 250, and they will take a couple weeks and go through it. And they'll think about what they would take out of it and what they would add to it. And then we have this epic conference call. It usually goes around 3 to 4 hours, but I've gotten really good at making it go fast because I've done this for several years now. And during this conference call, we add and subtract and hammer out, and we end up with a final list of 100 that is a combination of reader votes and curated judges selections. And it's important to note that this is not a ranked list. This is not like number 1 through number 100. It is just a list of 100 things that we love. And we generally categorize it just to break it out into categories to make it easier for readers to use it. So like, I can send you links after we're done talking to
Oh yeah, I would
so
love that.
what it looks like, I'm trying to remember categories off the top of my head and I can't, sorry.
No, don't worry about it. So you're going to do that, and this is sort of the recommendations, a kind of a curated list as well as a readers poll list of
Yeah.
the 100 books that you all think that readers in that genre ought to read or ought to check out.
Yeah, a combination of ones that they love and ones that we think that they'll love.
Oh, that's fabulous.
And that's why we say it's not 100 best. We do say that for search engine optimization for SEO, but like it's really 100 favorite. We're very careful about that wording.
Yeah, and it's important actually because what's best to one might not be best to someone
Yeah,
else.
we're
And
very careful about value judgments.
yeah,
Because
that's cool.
that's dangerous ground.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. So then you have the concierge, which is a winter thing, and what is that?
Oh, the concierge is so much fun. So we used to do year-end best of lists year after year after year, and we got super hella bored with it. And we were trying to come up with something else. And I believe that it was my colleague Rose Friedman, who works in the New York Bureau and is a real literature fiend, who came up with this idea of a searchable matrix of book covers sorted by categories, where you could, and the categories are, it's a visual matrix, and there's a list of categories down the side, and they are a mix of things like standard categories like nonfiction or science or history, and ones that we think are fun, like let's talk about sex or it's all geek to me. And you can click on any, or book club ideas, that's a big one. Staff picks is also a big one. So you can look at this list of categories, and you can say, okay, I want, and they're stackable. So you can say, I want a book for my book club, and it has to, hang on a second, Godfrey, yo, get out of here. Sorry.
Don't apologize. It's totally fine. I'm just lucky that Ninja, who is sleeping at my feet, is actually sleeping, because he could be walking on my head right now.
Godfrey likes to shred paper. It's a real problem.
Oh,
So anyways,
so
actually, can I rewind, because I realized I left something out. Let me go back to the beginning of this description. So
okay.
So the concierge is super fun. We ask our critics and a lot of staff members too, at the end of the year, to give us their favorite books of the year. And that also, much like the poll, is a gigantic, huge list that we have to winnow down to a reasonable number, usually around 200 or 300. Unlike the poll, though, there's 4 of us that work on the concierge. The poll is just me. So ultimately, the concierge is a list of around 200 or 300 of our staff and critics' favorite books of the year, arranged in a visual matrix. And down the side is a list of tags, and they are a mix of things, fairly straightforward tags like nonfiction or history, and fun tags like ladies first or book club ideas or funny stuff. And the tags are stackable. So you can click on them and you can say, I want a book for my book club, and I want it to be reasonably short so that it's easy to read, and I want it to center women, and I want it to be funny. So you would click on book club ideas, ladies first, rather short and funny stuff, and the concierge will return all the books in its list that meet those criteria. And when you mouse over them, you will see a blurb from one of our critics, and if you click through, you'll see the blurb, and you'll see e-commerce information, you'll see links to our coverage, to station coverage, and you'll see links to whatever library in your area has it. So it's a really useful tool, and it's super fun to play with.
Wow, that's excellent. We're going to need to put a link to that in the show notes from this last year. That's incredible. And
Yeah, and
so,
actually this last year, we finally put up the mega concierge, because it's been running for 7 years now, and we keep saying every year we're going to link all of them up into one gigantic concierge. And
ah,
our brilliant programmers finally rewrote the whole back end of it, so this year we could link them all up together. So the most recent one is the mega concierge edition that goes all the way back to 2013.
wow. So if you want to find books that fit all of these different criteria, like a book that fits all of these different criteria that you have in your head, you can search for it that way, and then it'll give you the 2 or 3 books out of the hundreds and hundreds that you have that might
Mhm.
fit or something like that. Oh,
Yep, and then all of our coverage and all the ways that you could possibly find that book. And it's actually, we can put the link up, but it's there's a short URL. It's just npr.org/bestbooks, and that's the way to find it.
that's perfect. Short URLs are best.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So now I have a little bit of an inkling about what it is that you do, which is a lot. And you are the genre fiction editor. And I would love to know from you, what is genre fiction as opposed to fiction? How do you define them and what are they?
That is a question that has prompted many an argument. And I think the best definition that I have come up with is that genre fiction is a marketing distinction. It tells you where in the bookstore you're going to find the book you're looking for. Um, because there, especially in the past few years, there's been so much bleed over between what we would think of as literary fiction and what we would think of as genre fiction, meaning sci-fi, fantasy, romance, mystery, thriller, basically what I would think of as all the fun stuff. um, this and the stuff that has historically been stigmatized as trashy or lowbrow. Those stigmas have begun to fade recently, which is just wonderful. And there's been a lot of blurring of the lines. But so, yeah, I mean, most people, if you ask them, will tell you genre fiction is a marketing distinction, not much more than that.
And yet those categories, science fiction, fantasy, urban fantasy, all of that, those are ones that I'll see if I go into a bookstore. They're there. You'll see like fiction, but then it'll say science fiction and fantasy, and this is all of the books that are currently on sale at the bookstore for science fiction and fantasy or romance or whatever. Those are all considered genre fiction because they aren't literary fiction. Is that how that works? Is that the distinction?
Kind of, yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting.
I
Okay.
mean, my own personal and somewhat snotty take on it, as someone who doesn't really read a lot of literary fiction, and this is just me. I don't
Mhm.
think that this is a given, that this is an accepted definition in the industry, is that genre fiction is more external. It tells you a story about things that are happening outside your head. And literary fiction is more internal. It tells you a story about what's happening inside your head.
Fascinating.
And I personally want to be told a story, so I'm genre fiction all the way.
Ah, okay. I got it. I got it. So something like Eat, Pray, Love by Gilbert, what would that be for you? Is that
Well,
liter
is that fiction? I thought that was a
well,
memoir.
you know what? It's funny because some aspects of it are fictionalized, and that's I believe. So that's but something, let's say it was fiction. What would that be, more literary fiction to you, or would that be genre fiction?
Oh, huh. That's an interesting question. I mean, and it's one that's hard to answer without seeming dismissive, because that sits right on the border of lit fic and what we would consider women's fiction,
Mhm.
which is its own genre. And I tend to think of it as romance without the sex. That's things like Ellen Hildebrand, or oh God, what's her name? Oh, my brain's gone blank. The one who wrote Her Sister's Keeper, Jodi Picoult. Um,
I was literally
Folks,
about to
if
say
you read those
Jodi
books at
Picoult and Jennifer
all,
Weiner. Uh-huh.
yeah, I love Jennifer Weiner. My God.
Yes, she's so great.
that is a genre that often gets looked down on. I think it even gets looked down on by romance fans who tend to think of it, like I said, as romance without the sex. Um, so yeah, that's a Eat, Pray, Love is an interesting thing because it's a little bit of a hybrid. It is very internal. It's about one woman's. It's about a little bit about human nature and this one woman's journey from one state of being to another, which I would classify as the provenance of literary fiction.
Hmm.
But it is also specifically by, about, and more or less for a female audience. So that puts it kind of on the border of women's fiction.
Interesting. Interesting. It's always fascinating to me when books sort of uh, can span genre. You know, that they can be one and part of one and then also part of another and still speak to different audiences. I think that sometimes authors get pigeonholed into one or the other, and
Yeah,
then
for
when they,
sure.
when they do something that's outside of that, it becomes challenging as far as marketing and all of that. And the publishing industry has changed a great deal, but at the same time, there's still some of that going on, even while so many people can self-publish and do all of these other things to get their books out there. So I wanted to ask you on your thoughts on where the publishing industry is today from your perspective as somebody who is a books editor. I would love to know what your thoughts are as far as where we are today, especially right now during the pandemic and everybody doing so much more reading. Where are we? What's
Yeah.
going on right now? What, because I'm furiously writing 2 books right now just because I have a little bit more time to do it. And I'm sure there are lots of authors right now that are doing the same thing, and there are lots of people reading voraciously. So from your perspective, where are we as far as publishing right now?
In a really interesting place. But before I get into that, I just want to say I'm a little worried that what I've been saying will be perceived as, you know, ghettoizing certain kinds of fiction or saying that men or women or whoever shouldn't read particular things. And I just want to say all books are for everybody. Read what makes you happy.
Absolutely.
Um, that being said, we're in a really interesting moment in the publishing industry. I am not super up on the exact facts and figures of the business right now in the pandemic. Interestingly, what seems to be happening is that it's hitting the physical book supply chain.
Hmm.
Like actual book deal, the publishing industry in terms of like book deals and stuff like that is rolling along, but like how are you going to get physical books? Don't know. That might be difficult in a few months. Um, so the publishing industry is also at this kind of inflection point, right? Where like it has for a long time been extremely white. And that is starting to change, partially because, as you said, self-publishing is allowing people, women and writers of color, to break down those barriers and bypass the traditional publishing structure. Um, you probably heard earlier this year about the kerfuffle around American Dirt and issues of cultural appropriation, and that
Mhm.
really brought up this conversation about who gets published, who profits from whose stories. And I'm hopeful that there's going to be some change in the industry. Historically, it's been real hard for authors of color to get published because the marketing people will be like, well, we don't know who's going to read that. That has just a limited audience. But they'll happily hire a white author who's telling the same story.
Hmm.
Um, so we're kind of at a point where that conversation's in the foreground, and hopefully going forward, we're going to see a lot more diversity in publishing. That's also happening in sci-fi and fantasy right now, particularly because the amazing and goddess-like N.K. Jemisin just won 3 Hugos in a row. I think she's the first person to do that, let alone the first African-American, let alone the first woman. So,
Woohoo!
and she attracted the ire of a lot of sort of reactionary forces in the sci-fi and fantasy world, which we will not get into because it's just sad. Um,
Hmm.
but in sci-fi and fantasy particularly, there's just this amazing boom right now of diverse writers and fantasy worlds that aren't European, and it makes me incredibly happy to see. And it's also just really good. Oh my god, if you haven't read Fonda Lee's Jade War series, do it. It's like a fantasy kung fu movie in your head.
Ooh, that sounds amazing. And I'm a martial artist, so of course my ears perked up. I
Oh,
have
you
not
would
read it.
love it. Oh my god, it's like Kung Fu Fighters powered by magical jade. Wow, it's really good. I mean,
I'm definitely putting that in the show notes. You must read this book, obviously.
it might, like, I know your taste and it might be a little too violent for you, but It's very stylish. It's like mob family crime drama set in this fictionalized Southeast Asian inspired nation that's recently shaken off colonialism, and the rebel forces who fought the colonizers have now morphed into dueling crime families that are fighting over the island supply of magical jade that powers the kung fu fighter. It's a whole thing. I love the book. It's
Wow.
really good.
That sounds like my kind of book, and I'm okay with violence depending on what the violence is. You know, if it's violence against women, I am not okay with it. If it's women being badass fighters, I'm
As
all
I
about it.
recall, the only violence against women involves female fighters who give as good as they get.
There, then I'm totally good with that. I have no problem with that. Yeah, I have two problems: like violence against women, violence against animals. I cannot do, but
Sure.
otherwise, violence, I'm fine with it. Um, so yeah, when you're talking about this idea of diversity really blossoming in the publishing industry, and it seems like it's coming around, do you see where do you see it going from here on in? What how do you see it growing? Where do you see the tendrils extending moving forward into the next few years?
Well, I want to say though, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, there has been a blossoming recently. The publishing industry overall has a long way to
Okay.
go. And what I would like to see uh, is going forward, and I'm starting to see it a little bit, is more editors being, more people of color being hired as editors, as managers, because that's the way you truly diversify without ghettoizing. You hire people of color and then let them direct what gets chosen and published and covered. You don't say like, oh, this is our black imprint and we're just gonna put black people there, you know?
Right. Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And within that, it allows for subjects that otherwise have not been getting sort of the light of day shined on them to get the light of day shined on them. And I think that's important, so important.
Yeah.
Because
Oh, another area that I'm seeing right now is a lot more trans representation, particularly in trans and non-binary, particularly in YA. And YA is where you've got a lot of real like current events issue coverage, because when it's not like fantasy dystopia like the Hunger Games, there's a lot of YA that deals with all of the crap that kids now have to deal with. And it's a place where I'm seeing a lot of real interesting things happen in terms of representation.
and that's that kind of diversity feeds into the exact next question that I
Oh,
was going to ask you, which is what are the most challenging subjects that you're seeing writers handling right now?
oh, interesting. I mean, we cover my YA reviewers tend to stick to fantasy, so
Mhm.
um I mean, are you asking about like sort of big issue books? Because I think racism is the big issue that racism definitely. I mean, it's the pervading sin of our society today, and it is a big thing that I see being tackled by writers in all. Oops, sorry, that was work bothering me. Sorry. Um, Anyways, what I was going to say is racism is an issue that I see getting tackled at all levels and in all genres. I mentioned N.K. Jemisin, and she won the Hugo for her Broken Earth trilogy, which is, among other things, I mean, it's just a really solid, engrossing speculative fiction series, but it
Mhm.
is also a subtle and powerful and punch you in the face meditation on colonialism and oppression. And that's the kind of thing that is going on all over the place in publishing right now. And I really like to see it.
It's yeah, I'm like I have other questions, but yeah, I just want to honor that for a second because there's so especially right now, we could be talking about things ripped from the headlines. It's so important to focus on it and to do it in a way that educates as well as enlightening. There's
Mhm.
something there's something that's so poignant about that to me that there are writers, especially writers of color, who are out there telling these stories that are so important to be told. Now, I have a question that you can choose not to answer.
Sure.
and I'm going to ask it anyway. You
Mhm.
said something that sparked this question, and I went, "Oh!" And now this seems like a really good time to bring it up. You said that there are publishers who will hire a white writer to tell a story that they would not have hired a writer of color to tell at times. That has happened. So how how do we go past that? How do we I don't know, bypass it? How would you suggest dealing with that process of the fact that diversity needs to be those diversity stories need to be told by the people who have lived through that?
Well, there's two halves to that question, which I am perfectly happy to answer. One is what I already said, which is that part of what will help that is getting more people of color into higher positions at publishers,
Mhm.
because that's how you get more attention on diverse writer, more representation in what gets published, is you have more representation in who's choosing the books to get published. The other thing I want to say is, because I was thinking about the whole kerfuffle over American Dirt, and one of the things that came out of that was white writers sort of being all huffy and saying, well, I can't write about that, I haven't lived it, I can only write about what I know because I'm white, boo-hoo. And that is not true. If you talk to any person, any writer, well, not any writer, but the people that I talk to, and I did some research on this, will say anybody can tell any story. The problem is when you do it badly, right?
Mhm.
So if a publisher, what happened with American Dirt is that the publisher hired a white writer to tell this story about Mexican refugees, and she did a really bad job of it, and
Mm.
that's what pissed people off.
Mhm.
Like, it was really inauthentic, the writing wasn't very good. People who had that experience looked at this book and said, what the hell is she talking about? So I don't want to say people can't tell stories about things that they haven't lived, but if you are going to do that, one of the things that's incumbent upon you is to speak to people that have had that experience, to incorporate what they say, to be able to take criticism and sit with it and honor it and not get all huffy, um, and to do your best to do it well. And before you do it, to make sure that the people that you're writing about have had a chance to tell their own story. So, if you're going to write a story about Mexican refugees, you look around and you say, hey, are there authors who've had this experience and have had a chance to tell their story? Is it the right time for me to jump in? Um, and if it is, then go ahead. And if it's not, write your book anyways and just sit on it for a couple of years. Use that time to make it better. So yeah, it's a two-part thing. There has to be more representation in the upper echelons of publishing, and there has to be more acknowledgement that if you are going to tell stories that are outside of your cultural experience, you need to do it well.
That's a succinct answer. I like it.
I I just did this podcast for NPR. They have this thing called Life Kit,
Mhm.
which is a sort of advice podcast on how to do various things. And so they asked me to do an episode on how to write your novel. And so I actually talked to a whole lot of writers about this, and specifically a writer and a friend of mine named Tempest Bradford, who helps run this workshop called Writing the Other. And she has a lot of really interesting stuff to say about that. So I gotta hand it to Tempest. I'm mostly parroting what she said.
Well, and it's a lot there's a lot of wisdom in what you said and in what Tempest says, because it is so, as someone who writes books, I feel like I want to be cognizant and aware and sensitive of the issues that surround the books I'm trying to write, or the potential issues. And I want to make sure that I'm not being ridiculous when I write characters who are different from who I am and from what I know. You know what I mean? So I think it's
Absolutely.
so that's and I wanted to, and so I appreciate you saying that, because I think this idea of writing diversity well, it can't be just from inside your head. I think you do have to do some research. For example, I'm writing this book all about a woman who wants to open a temple to the goddess Ishtar,
Mhm.
and who wants who's basically the priestesses of Ishtar used to teach people how to be good lovers, specifically men, but I'll say people, how to be good lovers to their partners, And that was what they did.
I know you've
And
told me about this book. I really want to read it.
I can't wait to get this one out there. But what I did as part of this is I opened up a survey to every single person I knew on social media and said, take the survey. And it's over 100 questions. And I had hundreds of people who are basically the question was, if you are, um, if you are if you are a woman or you identify as a woman, if you are a man or you identify as a man, these are the questions. These are the women's questions. These are the men's questions. And because I didn't want it to be just me, I didn't want it to be just out of my head what people might want to know or what people might have wanted to know about sex when they were young.
Mhm.
And so I had hundreds of people participate and take this survey. And what was really interesting is a writer friend of mine said, you've just gotten a lot of buzz for your book. And I said, why? And he goes, because many people wouldn't have done that research and you did. And I went, okay, I had no idea. For me, I just didn't want it to be just my opinion on this, because there is this idea inside my own head that there's no way I'm the ultimate authority. So I'm going to
Yeah.
get a
I
bunch
mean,
of,
yeah, it gets kind of ghettoized as this big cultural issue, like, oh, I can't write about but like, honestly, it's just a question of research and good world building. Like I know you wrote a book that was set in New York, and in order to do it accurately, you went to New York and looked at the things you were writing about. Like, why wouldn't you do that about people? you know?
very true, very true. Absolutely. And that to me, well, I mean, you would I was able to go to New York. Not everybody can. And if you're world building, planet Xylon and in the star system Berdicchio, then you obviously can't. So, but at the same time, I think, yeah, this idea of doing research, and it also, interestingly, what it did for me is it built community, and there are people who are, I get these little notes. I took your survey a while ago. When's the book coming out? And it's really to have that be a thing. So let me talk to you about the NPR readers community.
Sure.
What is that community? How do you join the community? And what would you like to have that community be if it's not where you'd like it to be yet?
I mean, if you read books, you're part of our community. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't engage with our reading community as much as I would like to. I said earlier that I run our social media feeds, but the problem is that's a full-time job, and it is approximately like 1/8 of the stuff I have to do every day.
Wow.
So, we have a pretty big Twitter following, and I really wish that I could engage with them more. I mean, there's some amazing statistic about like how much more likely NPR listeners are than other people to have read a book in the past week. I can dig it up somewhere if you really want it. But NPR listeners are crazy readers. They read a lot. They buy a lot of books. Back when I was a show producer, it was kind of a fun thing that we used to do to watch the Amazon sales figures of any book where we had interviewed the author, like before and after it aired. It would always just shoot way up because our listeners are big readers. And one of my favorite things that I do when I have time, although I have to cop to that I have not done it lately, is to interact with readers, with our audience on the hashtag, the Friday Reads hashtag on Twitter,
Hmm.
where like I talk about what I'm reading over the weekend and people tell me what they're reading. Um, Again, this is something I haven't had time for, and I really wish that I had. People will ask me for recommendations on Twitter, and I love doing stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know if I could say who our community is, like who I wanted to be. I mean, if you read books, you're my audience. Like,
Welcome all. That's
yeah,
right.
exactly.
Oh, so okay. Speaking of you reading and giving recommendations, I have
Mhm.
just a couple of questions about that. What
Sure.
has been Well, actually, let's step back a little bit. I'm going to ask you a question that I told you that I was going to ask you because I feel like that this question needs a little bit of preparation and a little bit of time thinking. What makes a book good to you?
Yeah, and I thought about it and I didn't come up with anything really succinct. That's the problem. Because there's a difference between good and enjoyable, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
I vastly enjoy books that are objectively bad. You could say objectively bad. Like I vastly enjoy books that I think are badly written. I'll
Hmm.
put it that way. But there's still something in them, some spirit or some whackdoodle creativity that makes me go, I'm just gonna keep reading this. It's terrible, but I'm just sucked in.
Well,
Um,
and that seems to me like if it's telling a good story, even if it's poorly written, there's still a story in there that's compelling or something like that.
There's still a story, or there's still a vision in there. Like, so the book that I'm thinking about, and I can't in good conscience recommend it, but I'm gonna anyways. Did you know that Tyra Banks wrote a young adult fantasy novel called Model Land?
No.
She did. It was supposed to be the first book of a trilogy. It came out, I think, in 2011, and it didn't do well enough to warrant any sequels, which is just crushing me because I desperately want to know what happens to the rest of the characters. It is absolutely bat bananas. Like, it's so bizarre that there is no way it could have been ghost written. Like, it is sheer unadulterated. This is telling me much more about it's like the weirdest fanfic. Like, this is telling me much more about the author than she thinks it is. Like,
I see.
it is this, well, I won't go too far into it, but it's about this bizarre fantasy land where everybody wants to be a model, and only the chosen few get to go to Model Land, which is like the Hogwarts of modeling, and it's on top of a golden mountain. And if you get to go there, you have a chance at becoming one of the 7 Intoxibellas, the only famous people in the world. And it is weirdly constructed, and plot lines come and go and characters come and go, but the vision of it, the overall world building, is so wildly imaginative that I just couldn't stop reading it.
Awesome.
So, but like, what makes a good book? Huh. A certain degree of writerly craft. Like, there are books where I'm like, I don't like this, but I can recognize that it's a well-written book. For me, I want to be told a story that has forward momentum. I want the writing to be fluid. I want the characters to be three-dimensional and interesting. And I'm a world building junkie. Like, I will get, and this is just me, like, other people will have different reactions, but I will get absolutely thrown out of a book and not enjoy it if there are obvious anachronisms in the dialogue. I read a fantasy novel that was supposed to be set in the 20s where the characters were talking about, oh, let's go grab a drink. And I was like, nobody said that in 1923.
So, okay.
So yeah,
So,
I wish I had a succinct answer for you, but I think it's mastery of craft.
okay.
Yeah, mastery of craft.
Okay. That's a valid answer. Absolutely. And I agree with you with world building, but I am actually going to ask you, what is world building?
Well, the aforementioned great and glorious N.K. Jemisin actually has a whole workshop on this, and I think she has her slides up online. I can probably try to find a link to that for you.
Oh,
But
that would
world
be
building
phenomenal.
is it's the art of creating a believable world for your characters to inhabit. And it primarily comes into play with sci-fi and fantasy because you are, if you're writing something that's set in the world that we all live in, there are going to be certain signifiers that everybody takes for granted, right? But if you are setting your story on what did you say? Planet Zebraxia or whatever it is, like,
Planet
then you have to
Xylon.
Planet Xylon. Then you have to think about from the ground up what Planet Xylon looks like, uh, and how you are going to immerse your readers in it, whether you are going to sort of build it from the ground up with every single possible detail about climate and various countries and their cuisines and their politics and what they all wear, in which case you are Robert Jordan and you're not a very good writer, but I'm going to read the hell out of you anyways because I'm obsessed with that shit. Or you are going to just kind of let readers sink into it and reveal details about the world as they become relevant to the plot. But yeah, it's the art of creating a believable world.
And that's beautiful. I like that. For anyone who, if you're listening to this and you're going, what is it? What how do I do this? What I want to write, but I don't. Now you have your very, very beginning. And in fact, I'm going to ask another question
Mm-hmm.
that if someone is sitting there going, I've always wanted to write a book, but I don't, what how would what's your recommendation for how people who want to write? or edit, how should they start? Like what is the process in your mind?
Ooh.
Someone who wants to write, what should they do besides the sit down and write something? What do you
I mean,
think
that's
they
the answer, honestly. So I did a whole podcast about this, and I can send you a link to it where I talked to like the guys from NaNoWriMo and I talked to authors. And that is 20 minutes of solid advice on how to get started writing. But the best advice I can give is to muzzle your internal editor, because I know that this is my problem. Um, and I think it's a problem that a lot of other people have, that when they sit down to write, there's a voice in their head that goes, "You're not a real writer. What are you talking about? You can't do this. That's bullshit." You know, if you don't put pen to paper and instantly you are Virginia Woolf, then you are nothing.
Mm.
And that's nonsense. Shut that voice up. The other thing I would say is when I spoke to the guy from NaNoWriMo, Grant Faulkner, he gave me this idea of time confetti, because a lot of times, like, you know, you're living your life and there's no way you can sit down you don't have, you know, like 2 hours where you can sit down at your perfect writing nook with your cup of coffee and the sunshine streaming in and you could write the great American novel. But what you probably have got, like, is this time confetti, which is like 5 or 10 or 15 minutes throughout the day where you would normally just kind of be screwing around on your phone looking at Twitter. And if you catch yourself doing that, you can go, no, I'm going to spend this time just putting my pen on the paper or my fingers on the keyboard and seeing what comes out.
Exactly that. I love that. That's beautiful because I think we all write differently. You know, there are I don't know anybody who's got a sunshiny nook and the perfect cup of coffee. I think everybody, I at least every author I know, we write when we can and we write where we can. And I think, you know, tell me what you think about this. I personally think that people write differently. Some people have to have pen and paper. Some people are better on the computer. I dictate text, the you know, voice to text. That's how I write my books. I dictate voice to text and I walk along with my phone and I talk into it, and it actually, I speak the books. So when you hear of people writing and doing their thing, what is the most prevalent as far as you're concerned, and is there one that's more optimal?
I don't know. Honestly, that's not a thing that I have ever asked people. I would say what's most optimal is what works for you. But I will say, it's really interesting to hear that you talk your books, because one of the most common pieces of advice that I give to my writers is, have you read this out loud? Because if it's hard to say, it's probably hard to read. Natural cadence is not a thing most people have, and that's not a value judgment, it just is.
Mhm.
But you can learn it, and part of how you learn it is by reading your stuff out loud, because, you know, your breaths will fall natural. The way your breaths fall naturally will help you fall into a writing rhythm that's much easier to read than if you hadn't been reading it out loud.
Absolutely. I agree completely. and and I sort of read it out loud as I'm writing it, and then I read it out loud afterwards
Mhm. Oh,
because
good.
that's storytelling to me. And to me, books are stories we just happen to have written down. So, you know, if you're going to tell a story, there's that's a beautiful way to do it. So thank you for that. I think
Sure.
that's really, because sometimes I think people, you know, we live inside our own heads and we don't remember that other people think similarly until they say something. So thank you for
Mhm.
saying that. Uh coming I do want to, I want to touch on the video games thing that you said. I had no
Yeah, sure.
idea. But before we do that, I want to
Mhm.
ask you, um what about your favorite books? Like, what was your favorite book as a child? What's your favorite book as an adult? And with the Friday readers thing that you mentioned, what are you reading right now? If you could give those three, I would love to hear it.
Oh God, it's so hard for me to quantify a favorite book. I mean, because I have read so, I mean, this is going to sound awfully egotistical, but I've read so many books. It's like picking a favorite color. Like, you can't, like, I have favorite books for moods, for, you know, like, if I want comfort, I read this. If I, you know,
So,
favorite
okay,
books.
you
I will
did.
tell you,
Uh-huh.
actually, when I have to answer this question with one book particularly, I will almost always say it's 1984 by George Orwell. Because and you have heard this story yourself, Isolde, but I'm sure your listeners have not because they don't know me. Uh, that is the book that I always say made me a nerd, because my dad, who you know, is a very intellectual dude,
Yes, he is.
and a professor at times of political philosophy, although now he's a writing coach, handed me that book in the year 1984 when I was 9 years old and said, "Here, I think you're ready to read this."
Wow.
What made him think that, I don't know. But so I read it, and obviously I didn't understand the core of it. Like
Right.
I would reread it every year, and I don't think the Goldstein's book section clicked for me until I was in my teens. But
Mhm.
it was my first encounter with dystopia, and I'm almost certain it was my first encounter with world building, with speculative fiction, because I was probably reading Anne McCaffrey's Pern books at around the same time, but I don't think at that age I had really read any sci-fi or fantasy yet. No, I
Mhm.
think I read the Pern books later. That was 7th grade. So I think it was probably the first sci-fi or sci-fi adjacent book that I had ever read.
Mm.
And it was my first experience of a world that seemed completely alien. Because if you read that book, the first sentence is, "It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13." And 9-year-old me went, "What? April's not cold and clocks don't strike 13. What is this?"
Right.
I was like transfixed. And it was from there, it was all downhill from there.
And a lifelong love affair began.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So sorry, I got distracted. What were you wanted my favorite book as a child?
And your favorite book as an adult, if you have one. And
Probably 1984 covers both of those,
okay.
honestly, because I read it when I was 9.
And what are you reading right now?
Oh, right now. So this is a thing that I actually want to talk about because I've had to do an awful lot of quarantine reading stories, and I want to just let people know that if your brain is so messed up by the pandemic that you can't read, that's okay too, because that happened to me. For 2 months, I could not read. All I did was
Wow.
knit and play Animal Crossing and watch Food Network. My brain was busted. And finally, about a week and a half ago, I picked up a book that I had to flip through for work, and I got sucked in and I started reading, and I was like, "Oh God." And it was like just cool rain falling in my head. Suddenly I could
Ah.
read again. So what I have done with that is I have ripped through Martha Wells' Murderbot Diaries, which are just so fun. These are a series of sci-fi novellas, although the first full-length book just came out, I think, this month, maybe. And they are about a security robot that has hacked its own governing module and become independent. It's an AI, right? It has independent thought. Uh, and it and all it really wants is for humans to leave it alone so that it can watch TV. Whereas it like downloads media. Like it has a soap opera that it loves called Rise and Fall of Sanctuary Moon, and it just wants humans to leave it alone so it can watch. But it keeps getting pulled into these scrapes with various crews of humans that it has been contracted to. And over the course of the 4 novellas, Murderbot, as it calls itself, even though it does not like humans and does not want to be human and wants humans to leave it the hell alone, is gradually becoming more human and forming bonds with humans and with other AIs and beginning to experience emotions which horrify it, because all it wants to do is be left alone to watch TV, but now it's having emotions. And it's wonderful. I love it. It's one of my favorite sci-fi books of the past decade or so was Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, which was similarly about an AI that had previously been the consciousness of a giant starship learning to exist as a human. So if you liked that, Murderbot is like that, but way more cranky and with a much worse attitude.
Ooh, sounds a little like Red Dwarf for some reason. Um,
Kinda, yeah.
yeah,
It's like
just
Ancillary Justice crossed with Red Dwarf. That's a
I
good
love
way of
it.
putting it.
That's great. Oh, that's fabulous. Okay. I say this to everybody I interview. I just have a few more questions if that's
Sure.
okay. So, is there a taboo subject? Is there a subject people ought not to be writing about? And if so, what is it?
Huh. Um, That's an interesting question, because it goes back to what I was talking about before. There's really nothing that's off limits as long as you do it well and thoughtfully and are prepared for people to be mad at you about it.
So
But
have
I'm
a thick
serious
skin.
about doing it well and thoughtfully, and that
Okay.
is a way harder job than most people think it is. Um, I mean, I don't want somebody writing the next Turner Diaries. Like, that's off limits.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you're just, unless you're spewing vile hatred, no, there should be no limits. Just make sure that it is the right time for you to tell the story, that you are the person to tell the story, and that you're doing it well.
That's fair. And doing it well there's so much that goes into that, really studying the craft and really practicing.
Mhm.
They say somewhere, I've read somewhere, that you write 3 books before really you ought to consider publishing one. Don't try to publish the first one you
There is a
write.
thing I've encountered that I think of as first novel syndrome, yes.
Yeah. And it's funny, I go back, I've been doing this thing where I have been getting on Facebook Live and reading my books. And just because, right? Just
Mhm.
because I wanted to read them. And I read book 1 of my series and went, "Hmm, okay, I'm a different writer now." And it's nice to know that I didn't hate the book. I know a lot of writers hate their first book. I didn't hate it. I liked it fine. But I'm a very different writer today than I was back in 2011. So it's good to know that hopefully, we grow as we write more, we develop our own voice. And that's another question I wanted to ask you,
Absolutely.
actually, is what is your voice? What is a writer's voice?
That is an interesting question. Can I actually, before I answer that, just go back to the previous question, because I thought of one more thing
Sure, of course.
about things that are taboo. I What I had said was nothing is taboo as long as you're not spewing vile hatred, and you do it well. It is the right time for you to tell the story. You research it. You are prepared to take criticism. And the other thing is, if you take your story to a member of the group that you're writing about and they say no, you put it down. You are ready to give it up if you find out that you are on the wrong track. So that's an important thing. Anyways,
That makes, it makes a lot of sense, for sure. For sure.
um, so voice. Okay, so
Voice.
voice is really interesting. And I find that it is something that's hard to teach. I almost said it can't be taught, but I think probably it can be if people learn and grow as writers. It's hard though. And I don't think there's a way to quantify it. I can tell you how I try to draw it out of people,
Hmm.
because it's a thing I work on a lot with my reviewers. The primary thing I tell them is don't act like you're on NPR. Because that happens sometimes with people that are new to working for me. They will send me a piece and it will be full of $50 vocab words and contorted sentences and I'll be like, no, that you're writing for what you think NPR is. You are not writing in your own voice. Talk to me about this book as if you are my smart friend who is very excited about this book and we are having a cup of coffee and you are telling it to me. So the other thing I'll say, and if you listen to the podcast episode that I'm going to link you to, this will come up too, but it's important. Voice is far more linked to what you read than you think it is. Like a lot of people, that's my other piece of advice that I tell people, like read, read, read. And they'll say, oh no, but I don't want to be influenced. And the answer to that is everybody's influenced, man. Shakespeare was writing fanfic, okay? So if you are writing it in your own precious personal voice, it is your voice. But you will never figure out what you like and don't like in writing unless you read a lot. So yeah, like it's interesting. Voice is this thing that you can only kind of triangulate around. Like it's a mixture of your own conversational style and what you do and don't like. And when you have it, it comes through on the page, and I can tell who's writing by looking at the sentences. Like I have a particular writer, I think I mentioned him before, Jason Sheehan, and his voice is so particular and powerful on the page that I could look at a piece without a byline and go, oh my God, Sheehan wrote this. And that's really what I love in writers. Like I want that voice to just pop off the page so that I feel like I know you.
And that's all goes back to sort of building community, when people know the writer based on the words on the page, that feels almost like a friend to me. I feel very close to the authors that I love, even though the only author I've ever met truly that I adore is Judy Blume. Everybody else I've just loved I've worshiped from afar, and yet I feel like I would love to have a cup of tea with them. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
exactly. That's exactly
So,
right. That's a good point. And I'm really glad to hear that Judy Blume was cool. I have actually never met her.
oh,
I would hate it if she wasn't cool.
she would. Yeah, the next time we go to Key West, I'll hook you up.
Cool.
Yeah, she was amazing and a complete delight. So which made me feel so happy because I read English in part because I read her books when we first immigrated. So that's how I sort of learned how to read, because no one actually taught me. So, okay, we're down to the last few
Oh, good, because
questions.
it's getting on towards dinner time. I don't know if you can hear it, but as we say in this house, the flops phone is ringing.
I understand. I hear it. I love it. So yeah, and I'm actually I won't keep you too much longer, but I did want to say video games. Excuse me. Hello. Let's talk about that for a second.
Sure.
What's that? What's that? What are you doing for NPR as far as video games?
Well, so uh, for a long time, we've run this sort of semi-regular series called Reading the Game, which is about storytelling in video games. But we've sort of begun to ramp up video game coverage because, I mean, video games are, along with movies and TV, one of the preeminent art forms of our time, and they are amazing vehicles for storytelling. Like the big studio video games that are around now, and I'm not talking about stuff like, first person shooters like Overwatch or Fortnite or whatever, although those are super interesting in all kinds of ways.
Hmm.
Um, but the sort of not degree of novelistic storytelling and cinematic storytelling. Why did my printer just turn itself on? Jesus, stop.
Well, you said we're talking about technology, so
Yeah,
technology had to make itself known.
my printer does this weird thing where like it will refuse to print in the moment, but then a day or two later, it'll print whatever I want it.
It likes to keep you
Anyway,
on your toes.
anyways, what I was going to say is the degree of sort of cinematic and novelistic storytelling that's going on in, just to name a couple of games that are like either out right now or about to come out. Hang on a second. Printer,
Hmm.
what the cut it out. Okay.
I love the fact that you were going, what the shit? And then it went ding dong.
I think
It's
I
like
did
you
cuss
bleeped
at one point.
yourself.
You can bleep that out if you want.
Oh, no,
I'm
no,
trying
no.
to do my radio mannerisms and not actually cuss.
No worries. Actually, the beauty of doing this podcast and making it as unedited as possible is that I just put the little explicit sign on the episode and we're good to go. So
Okay,
I'm
good.
not worried about it.
Cool. Anyways, games right now that they're basically like sort of movies and novels combined. They're just fascinating. There's so much going on, and and in other games that are less story driven, like I mentioned, sort of first person shooters like Fortnite and Overwatch, those are really interesting in terms of their implications for the way we form communities and interact online, because those have these huge online communities where people are chatting with each other and playing together and sometimes being complete assholes to each other. And then there's just also auxiliary things like Discord, which is a chat service for gamers that is really interesting. A lot of stuff goes on there, like, and this is awful, but it is newsworthy. A lot of stuff related to the Charlottesville disturbances was planned on Discord. So like video games
Really?
and the community around them are incredibly newsworthy right now. Like we should be paying attention to them. So we have this regular column that we just started called Join the Game, which is a combination of game reviews and gaming culture analysis. There are a lot of like young nerdy NPR is full of nerds. This is not a surprise, right? But there are also a lot of gamers. I mean, me personally, I'm part of an incredibly vibrant and obsessive Pokemon Go community at work, because the NPR sign, for all you out there in Radioland, the NPR building sign is a Poke Gym. So if you want to come raid with us and you're in DC, please do. I mean, once we get back to the building, I don't know when that will be.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of gamers on staff, and since we started doing Join the Game, I've been getting all these interesting pitches from people who want to write essays about the games that they love and the impact that games have had on their life. Particularly now, of course, during the pandemic when we're all stuck at home, that's part of why Animal Crossing is so huge, right? Because you want to escape to this beautiful cartoony world with cute animals and no viruses. So yeah,
Absolutely.
we're doing some on-air coverage. We're ramping up reviewing. I'm still kind of in the early stages of figuring it out because, again, it's on top of my other job too, my other 14 jobs. But I do feel very passionately that this is an area of culture that we cannot afford to ignore.
It's a multi-billion-dollar business in addition to being a haven for people to build community. It's a
Yep.
huge business. It's
Mhm.
huge. So it makes a lot of sense that on multiple levels that you would be covering it and helping other people find it. I think that's great.
Mhm.
And I think there's an evolutionary process going on here. The way we tell stories is changing, and video games are another sort of piece of that pie now. And it started with the games back in the 60s and 70s, and the arcade games in the 80s, and now here we are where you can have incredible worlds with incredible visuals and audio
Yep,
right
we've come a
there.
long way. I mean, I grew up with an Atari 2600 and I still have a soft spot for that, but man,
Yeah, it's
it's
a
amazing.
different it's a different kettle of corn, as I like to say.
Yeah.
So how can people find you? Where are you on social? I know as far as NPR, you are
I'm
what?
NPR Books, yeah, on Facebook and Twitter. My personal Twitter account, which I am really erratic and crappy about, but feel free to try to find me there, is Petramatic, like automatic, Petramatic. And mostly I post pictures of my cats. So if you want to see what Godfrey looks like, um,
Or
there's a lot
flops?
of pictures of him on my Twitter account.
Yes, it's Godfrey, Pete, and Flops, and they are wonderful
Yep,
kitties.
yep, yep.
And then one last question before I let you go. It's a question I ask everybody who is on the show, and it's something that I think is it's something that I like to ask because I think it allows you to conceptualize and really sort of funnel things down into one thing.
Mhm.
If you had a plane, and I know how much you love to fly, but if you had a plane and you were to skywrite something for the whole world to see, what would you say?
Hmm. Luckily, there's a phrase that captures both my passion for reading and my love of RuPaul's Drag Race, and that is reading is what? Fundamental.
Fabulous. Fabulous. I thought you were going to say what people say about me behind my back ain't none of my business. That's what because that's another RuPaulism.
It's true.
So yeah. Yeah, this has been so wonderful. I am so grateful to you for taking the time, and I know you have cats to feed, but
Oh,
really
it was
thank
so
you.
much fun. The cats can suck it. They can wait.
Yeah, I know you wait on them hand and foot, so I understand.
Godfrey is like right here on my desk lying on the mouse.
I love it. I
Hi.
love it. Yeah. So yeah, Petra, really, I'm so grateful that you took the time and to basically drop this much wisdom about so many subjects. And I really encourage all of you who are listening, find Petra and follow her. She is the queen of reading as far as I'm concerned. And if she recommends a book, I've never had her recommend a book to me that I did not love. So find her, follow
Oh.
her, and you will not be sorry. In fact, I'll get all sorts of tweets coming at me going, "Thank you for the recommendation. This is awesome." So thank you again, Petra. This is Isolde Trachtenberg for the Creative Mindset Podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed today's show. If you are liking what you're hearing, rate and review the podcast wherever you listen, whether it's on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you happen to tune in. And also comment and let me know. I'd love to hear from you about what you think about the guests that I'm having, because you know that the podcast has shifted gears a little bit. Now it's really pretty much an interview show where I'm talking to creative peak performers who are sharing their wisdom and expertise to help the next generation of creative peak performers. So if you're here and you're listening, please let me know what you're thinking. Until next time, this is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I send you all of my love. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2020. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, this is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I send you all of my love. I hope you've enjoyed that conversation with the phenomenal Petra Mayer. I wanted to run it because I wanted to honor her, as I said earlier, in the best way I knew how, which is on the airwaves. Petra grew up loving radio, working in radio, from being a DJ at her college radio stations, to her work at Radio Free Europe, to her work at NPR, to her work in the Philosopher's Tones as a singer in the group that I lead and manage. She is, was, and ever will be incredible, a phenomenal friend and artist, and I will miss her dreadfully. If you want to support NPR, please go to npr.org and donate. That is Petra's passion, radio. And also, she loved cats. So if you want to support your local cat shelter in any way as a remembrance to her, I'm sure that would be amazing too. Until next time, this is Isolde Trachtenberg reminding you to be bold, be creative, and be kind.